The first snow of December dusted the neighborhood like powdered sugar, transforming the ordinary suburb into something magical. For most residents of Pine Creek Lane, the arrival of winter meant holiday decorations, shopping lists, and family gatherings. But for Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived alone in the blue house at the end of the street, winter only emphasized her solitude. She had lived in that house for nearly 40 years. After her husband passed away 15 years ago, the spacious family home had become increasingly quiet. Her children had grown up and moved to different states, visiting only occasionally during holidays when their busy schedules permitted. Most days, Mrs. Chen found comfort in her routines, tending to her small garden in warmer months, reading books from the local library, and occasionally chatting with neighbors who stopped by. Christmas was particularly difficult. The cheerful decorations and sounds of family celebrations from nearby homes only highlighted what was missing in hers. That's why, on a snowy December evening 10 years ago, the unexpected knock on her door had startled her so much. When she opened the door, wrapped in her old cardigan against the chill, she found a small boy standing on her porch. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with cheeks flushed from the cold and a too large knitted hat pulled down over his ears. "Hello," he said simply, holding up a crudely wrapped package. "This is for you." Mrs. Chen blinked in surprise. "For me? I think you might have the wrong house, young man." The boy shook his head firmly. "No, it's for the lady in the blue house. That's you." He thrust the package forward insistently. Bewildered, Mrs. Chen accepted the gift. "Thank you, but who are you? Who sent you?" The boy just smiled. "Merry Christmas," he called out, already turning to leave. He bounded down her snowy front steps and ran down the street before she could ask anything else. Standing in her doorway, she watched his small figure disappear around the corner. The package in her hands was wrapped in newspaper comics and secured with too much tape, clearly wrapped by a child's hands. She brought it inside and carefully opened it to find a handmade clay ornament shaped like a star, painted in bright yellow with uneven strokes. Mrs. Chen hung the star on her small artificial Christmas tree, which she had almost not bothered to set up that year. The unexpected gift brought a smile to her face every time she looked at it. She never expected to see the boy again. But exactly 1 year later, on December 20th, another knock came at her door. There he stood, slightly taller but with the same bright eyes and now holding another small package. "Hello again," he said. "Merry Christmas." This time, Mrs. Chen was ready. "Would you like to come in for some hot chocolate?" she asked. "It's very cold out there." The boy seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. "Just for a little bit. I need to be home before dark." His name, she learned, was Tommy. He lived a few blocks away with his mom. When Mrs. Chen asked why he had chosen her house for his Christmas delivery, he shrugged and said, "You looked like you needed a present." The disarming honesty of children. That second year, the gift was a pinecone covered in glitter. The third year, a string of painted macaroni beads. Each December, Tommy would appear, stay for hot chocolate and cookies, chat for exactly half an hour, and then insist he needed to get home. Their conversations were simple. Tommy talked about school, the books he liked to read, and his dream of becoming a scientist someday. Mrs. Chen told him stories about her own childhood and taught him words in Mandarin that he would carefully repeat. She never pushed for more information about his home life, sensing an unspoken boundary. By the 5th year, their Christmas visit had become the highlight of her holiday season. Tommy was entering his teens now, his voice occasionally cracking mid-sentence, but he still came faithfully each December 20th with his handmade gift. "Why do you keep coming?" Mrs. Chen asked him once, genuinely curious. Tommy looked down at his hot chocolate. "My mom says it's important to keep promises," he said simply. "And I like our talks." Mrs. Chen began preparing for these visits weeks in advance, baking Tommy's favorite cookies and thinking of stories she hadn't yet shared with him. She found herself collecting interesting facts throughout the year that she thought might interest a curious young mind. The neighbors noticed these annual visits but didn't make much of them. Mrs. Chen was private about her special friendship. When asked, she would only say, "Just a young friend stopping by." She didn't want to risk anything that might disrupt their tradition. During their 8th Christmas visit, Tommy, now 15, seemed different, quieter, more thoughtful. When Mrs. Chen asked if everything was okay, he hesitated before answering. "We might be moving," he said finally. "Mom got a job offer in Colorado." Mrs. Chen felt a pang in her heart but smiled encouragingly. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for your family." "I'll still come next Christmas," Tommy promised earnestly. "Even if we move, I'll find a way to visit on December 20th. Mrs. Chen patted his hand. "Life takes us where we need to go, Tommy. Don't worry about an old woman's Christmas tradition." But Tommy was insistent. "I'll be here," he said with the determination only teenagers can muster. "Same time next year." As he left that day, Mrs. Chen watched him walk away with an uneasy feeling. Something told her things were about to change, but she pushed the thought aside. After all, they had their tradition, and Tommy had never broken a promise in 8 years. What she didn't know then was that the following year would bring changes neither of them could have anticipated. And that next December, as the snow fell gently on Pine Creek Lane, she would stand by her window watching and waiting for a knock that wouldn't come. The 9th December arrived with unusual harshness. Heavy snowfall had blanketed Pine Creek Lane for days, and the temperatures dropped so low that the local schools closed early for winter break. Mrs. Chen had been preparing for Tommy's visit since Thanksgiving, carefully selecting a small gift for him, a pocket compass she thought might be useful for a boy who loved science and exploration. She had heard nothing about whether Tommy's family had actually moved to Colorado. The boy had never shared his last name or exact address, and Mrs. Chen had always respected his privacy. Their connection existed in a bubble, just December 20th, just her blue house, just hot chocolate and stories exchanged by the light of her modest Christmas tree. On the morning of December 20th, Mrs. Chen woke early. She baked fresh chocolate chip cookies, Tommy's favorite, and prepared her special hot chocolate mix with a hint of cinnamon. She placed the ornaments he had given her over the years, the star, the glittery pine cone, the macaroni necklace, and the others, in a prominent display on her mantel. The snow continued to fall throughout the day, and as afternoon approached, Mrs. Chen found herself checking the clock frequently. Tommy usually arrived around 4, after school let out. By 3, she had positioned herself near the window, watching the street through the curtain of snow. 4 o'clock came and went. So did 5, and then 6. Outside, darkness had fallen, making the snowfall visible only in the glow of streetlights. Mrs. Chen kept the porch light on, its beam creating a golden pathway through the snow-covered steps. "He's just running late," she told herself, trying to ignore the worry gnawing at her. Maybe the snow delayed him. Or perhaps they did move, and he's trying to find a way back for his visit. But as 7 o'clock approached, the worry turned to concern. Tommy had never been late before. Mrs. Chen made herself a cup of tea and sat by the phone, wondering if she should try to do something. But what could she do? Call the police to report that a boy who visited her once a year hadn't shown up? They would think she was a confused old woman. Besides, she didn't even know Tommy's last name or where exactly he lived. By 9 o'clock, the cookies had gone cold on their plate. The hot chocolate ingredients remained untouched on the counter. Mrs. Chen finally admitted to herself that Tommy wasn't coming. Maybe they had moved after all. Maybe the snow was too heavy for him to make the journey. Maybe his parents had finally put a stop to his visits to a stranger. All reasonable explanations, she told herself, trying to push away the heaviness in her heart. That night, Mrs. Chen slept poorly, waking several times thinking she heard a knock at the door. By morning, the snow had stopped, but Tommy still hadn't appeared. The days after December 20th passed slowly. Mrs. Chen found herself walking around the neighborhood, looking for any sign of Tommy or trying to spot a house he might have come from. But Pine Creek Lane connected to several other streets, and there were hundreds of houses within walking distance. Christmas came and went. Mrs. Chen received phone calls from her children and video calls with her grandchildren opening presents. She smiled and chatted, not mentioning the boy who hadn't come or the ornament display that now felt incomplete. In January, Mrs. Chen gathered her courage and approached some of her neighbors, carefully asking if they knew a family with a teenage boy named Tommy who might have moved recently. Most shook their heads. One neighbor, Mrs. Patel, thought she might know who Mrs. Chen was talking about. There was a single mother with a son who lived in the rental house on Maple Street, Mrs. Patel said. I think the boy's name might have been Tommy or Tony. They were quiet, kept to themselves. I haven't seen them around lately, come to think of it. Mrs. Chen thanked her and walked to Maple Street that same afternoon. The rental house was a small, gray duplex with peeling paint. It looked empty, the windows dark and without curtains. A "For Rent" sign had been placed in the tiny front yard. Gathering her courage, Mrs. Chen knocked on the door of the neighboring unit. A young woman answered, bouncing a baby on her hip. I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Chen said, but I'm looking for information about the family that used to live next door. A mother and her son? The woman nodded. They moved out a few months ago. Kind of suddenly, actually. I didn't see them much, but the boy was always polite when we crossed paths. Do you happen to know where they went? Mrs. Chen asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. Sorry, no idea, the woman replied. They were pretty private. The landlord might know something, though. His name's Mr. Rivera. He owns the hardware store downtown. Mrs. Chen thanked her and left, her heart heavy. The story was coming together now. Tommy and his mother had indeed moved away. But why hadn't he said goodbye? He had promised to visit, even from Colorado. The next day, Mrs. Chen visited Rivera's hardware. The owner, a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair, listened to her story with a sympathetic expression. Ah, the Caldwells, he said, recognizing her description. Lisa and her boy. Good tenants, always paid on time until the end. She lost her job at the factory last fall. Tough situation. Do you know where they went? Mrs. Chen asked. Mr. Rivera hesitated. I'm not supposed to give out that information, ma'am. Privacy concerns and all that. But I can tell you they were heading west. Lisa had family in Nevada who offered to take them in until she could get back on her feet. Nevada, not Colorado. The job offer must have fallen through, Mrs. Chen realized. Or perhaps it had never existed at all, just a hopeful story Tommy told himself and her. As winter deepened, Mrs. Chen often found herself thinking about Tommy and his mother, imagining them starting over in Nevada. Had they found stability there? Was Tommy in a good school? Did he think about their Christmas tradition, or had it already faded in his memory as he adjusted to his new life? She kept the ornaments displayed on her mantel, unwilling to pack them away. Each one represented not just a year, but a moment of connection in what had been a very lonely chapter of her life. Whatever had happened, whatever had kept Tommy from returning, those moments had been real. And as February's chill gave way to March's first hints of spring, Mrs. Chen made a decision. She would not simply wait by the window next December. Sometimes, she realized, you had to go looking for answers yourself. Spring brought new life to Pine Creek Lane. Flowers pushed through the soil in Mrs. Chen's garden, and the days grew longer. Yet for Mrs. Chen, the changing seasons only marked time passing without answers about Tommy. She had always been a private person who kept to herself, but now she found herself stepping outside her comfort zone. She began volunteering at the local library, hoping to hear something about Tommy or his mother, Lisa Caldwell. She joined the neighborhood association and attended community meetings, listening carefully whenever anyone mentioned families who had moved away. During one such meeting in April, Mrs. Chen finally gathered the courage to speak up. "I'm looking for information about a family," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "A single mother named Lisa Caldwell and her teenage son, Tommy. They moved to Nevada last year, and I'm trying to get in touch with them." The room fell silent. Most people looked blank, but an older gentleman in the back raised his hand. "Lisa worked at the factory with my daughter before it downsized," he said. "Tough break, that. My daughter kept in touch with her for a bit after she left. I could ask if she has contact information." Hope flickered in Mrs. Chen's heart for the first time in months. "I would appreciate that very much," she said. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Chen received a phone number for Lisa Caldwell. She sat staring at the piece of paper for hours, rehearsing what she would say. Would Lisa even know about Tommy's annual visits? Would she think it strange that an elderly woman was trying to track down her son? Finally, heart pounding, Mrs. Chen dialed the number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. A woman's tired voice asked the caller to leave a message. "Hello, this is Mrs. Chen from Pine Creek Lane," she said after the beep, her voice shaking slightly. I'm calling about your son, Tommy. He used to visit me every Christmas for the past 8 years. I just wanted to make sure he's all right. Please call me back if you can." She left her number and hung up, hands trembling. The ball was in Lisa's court now. All Mrs. Chen could do was wait. Days passed with no return call. Mrs. Chen tried to keep busy with her garden and her new volunteer position at the library, but her thoughts kept returning to the phone call. Had Lisa received the message? Was she deliberately not responding? Just as Mrs. Chen was losing hope, her phone rang one evening in early May. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Nevada area code. "Hello?" Mrs. Chen answered, heart racing. "Is this Mrs. Chen?" A woman's voice, cautious but not unfriendly. "Yes, this is she. This is Lisa Caldwell, Tommy's mom. I got your message." Mrs. Chen sat down, suddenly feeling lightheaded. "Thank you for calling back. I hope I'm not intruding, but I was worried when Tommy didn't come by last Christmas." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm trying to understand," Lisa said slowly. "You say Tommy visited you every Christmas? For 8 years?" Mrs. Chen's confusion grew. "Yes, every December 20th since he was 8 years old. He would bring me a handmade gift and stay for hot chocolate. Didn't you know?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Chen, I think we need to have a conversation about this. Tommy never mentioned visiting anyone specific on Christmas. He would go out in the neighborhood to deliver cards and small gifts, but he never said anything about regular visits to one person." The revelation stunned Mrs. Chen. All these years, she had assumed Tommy's mother knew about their tradition. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought you were aware. He started coming when he was very young, and I always made sure he left before dark." "It's okay," Lisa said, her tone softening. "Tommy has always been independent and kind-hearted. It's just like him to make a special friend and keep it to himself." Mrs. Chen hesitated before asking the question that had been haunting her for months. "Is Tommy all right? Is that why he didn't come last Christmas?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Mrs. Chen thought they might have been disconnected. Then she heard Lisa take a deep breath. "Tommy's been going through a difficult time," she finally said. "We left Pine Creek rather suddenly when I lost my job. The move was hard on him. New school, new town, and then in November." She trailed off. November? Mrs. Chen prompted gently. He was diagnosed with leukemia, Lisa said, her voice breaking slightly. It was advanced by the time they caught it. He spent most of December in the hospital, including the 20th. I'm sure he wanted to contact you, but everything happened so fast. The words hit Mrs. Chen like a physical blow. Tommy, sick in a hospital bed, while she had been waiting by her window, assuming he had simply forgotten about her. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen whispered. How is he doing now? He's fighting, Lisa said, a hint of pride breaking through the weariness in her voice. The treatments are brutal, but he's responded better than the doctors initially expected. He's a strong kid. Yes, he is, Mrs. Chen agreed, thinking of the determined little boy who had appeared on her doorstep so many years ago. I'm going to tell him about your call, Lisa continued. It will mean a lot to him. He's been down lately, missing his friends from home. Knowing someone was thinking about him enough to track us down, that will lift his spirits. Mrs. Chen wiped away a tear. Could I perhaps send him something? A card or a gift? He would love that, Lisa said, and gave Mrs. Chen their address in Reno. That night, Mrs. Chen couldn't sleep. The image of Tommy in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, filled her thoughts. The 8 handmade ornaments on her mantel caught the moonlight streaming through her window, each one a testament to a connection that had meant more to her than she had realized. The next morning, Mrs. Chen made a decision. She packed a small suitcase, called her neighbor to ask if they would water her plants, and booked a bus ticket to Reno. Some things couldn't wait until next Christmas. Some journeys needed to begin now. As the bus pulled away from the station, Mrs. Chen clutched her purse containing a small gift for Tommy, the compass she had meant to give him last Christmas, and something even more valuable, a photo album documenting all 8 of their Christmas visits, with pictures of each ornament and notes about their conversations from each year. She didn't know what she would find in Reno or how Tommy would react to her surprise visit. But for the first time since December 20th, Mrs. Chen felt a sense of purpose. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer waiting by the window for a knock that might never come. The journey to Reno was longer than Mrs. Chen had anticipated. The bus stopped in several small towns along the way, and she spent 2 nights in roadside motels before finally arriving in Nevada. She had not traveled this far alone since her husband passed away, and at times, doubt crept in. Was she overstepping boundaries? Would Tommy and his mother welcome an unexpected visitor during such a difficult time? But whenever doubts surfaced, Mrs. Chen would open her purse and look at the photo album she had prepared. 8 Christmases, 8 ornaments, 8 afternoons of conversation and hot chocolate. Whatever happened in Reno, she needed to close this chapter properly. Reno was nothing like her quiet suburban neighborhood. The busy streets and unfamiliar layout overwhelmed her at first. She checked into a modest hotel near the hospital and spent the evening gathering her courage for the visit ahead. The next morning, Mrs. Chen called Lisa to let her know she was in town. You came all this way? Lisa sounded shocked. Mrs. Chen, you didn't have to do that. I know, Mrs. Chen replied softly. But I wanted to. Is it all right if I visit Tommy today? There was a pause. Actually, this might be perfect timing. Tommy's been having a rough week. The last round of chemo hit him hard, and he's feeling pretty low. Seeing someone from home might be just what he needs. They arranged to meet at the hospital at noon. Mrs. Chen arrived early, stopping at a gift shop to buy a small plant to brighten Tommy's room. As she walked through the hospital corridors, following the directions to the pediatric oncology ward, her heart pounded so loudly she was sure others could hear it. Lisa was waiting outside Tommy's room. In person, she looked younger than Mrs. Chen had imagined, probably in her mid-30s, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. But her smile was warm as she extended her hand. It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Chen. Tommy was so surprised when I told him you were coming. He couldn't believe it. Mrs. Chen returned the smile, though anxiety fluttered in her stomach. How is he today? Lisa's smile faltered slightly. He's having a better day than yesterday. The doctors are encouraged by his latest test results, but the treatment takes a toll. She gestured toward the door. He's waiting for you. Nothing could have prepared Mrs. Chen for the sight of Tommy in his hospital bed. The vibrant, energetic boy who had bounded up her porch steps was now thin and pale, his head completely bald from the chemotherapy. But when he saw her, his face lit up with the same bright smile she remembered. Mrs. Chen. You really came. His voice was weaker than she remembered, but filled with genuine delight. Mrs. Chen moved to his bedside, fighting back tears. Of course I came. I missed our Christmas visit. Tommy's eyes darted to his mother, who nodded encouragingly, and then back to Mrs. Chen. I'm sorry I couldn't make it this year. I wanted to call you, but I didn't have your number, and then everything happened so fast. Don't apologize, Mrs. Chen said firmly, pulling a chair up to his bedside. You're focusing on getting better. That's what matters now. For the next hour, they fell into a conversation that felt remarkably similar to their Christmas visits. Tommy showed her the books he was reading, talked about the science videos he watched on his tablet, and introduced her to his favorite nurses. Mrs. Chen noticed that despite his illness, his curiosity and enthusiasm remained intact. Lisa watched their interaction with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. I've never seen him connect with an adult like this outside of family, she whispered to Mrs. Chen when Tommy was distracted by a nurse checking his vitals. He's always been shy around strangers. He was never shy with me, Mrs. Chen replied, remembering the confidence with which 8-year-old Tommy had presented his first handmade gift. Even as a small boy, he seemed to know exactly what he wanted to say. When the nurse left, Mrs. Chen presented Tommy with the compass. I was saving this for our Christmas visit, she explained. I thought you might like it for your science explorations. Tommy turned the brass compass over in his hands, his eyes wide. This is so cool. Mom, look, it's got a real glass face and everything. It's beautiful, Lisa agreed, catching Mrs. Chen's eye with a silent thank you. Then Mrs. Chen brought out the photo album. I also made this for you. To remember all our Christmas visits. Tommy opened the album, his expression growing more serious as he turned the pages. Each spread featured a photograph of one of his handmade ornaments, alongside Mrs. Chen's handwritten notes about their conversations that year. She had documented his changing interests, the books he had mentioned, and the stories she had shared with him. You kept track of all of it? Tommy asked, his voice hushed with wonder. Mrs. Chen nodded. Every visit was special to me. Tommy looked up at his mother. See, Mom? This is why I kept going back every year. Mrs. Chen actually listens. Lisa squeezed her son's shoulder gently. I can see that now. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Chen noticed Tommy's energy fading. His responses became shorter, and his eyelids grew heavy. Lisa noticed too. I think Tommy needs to rest now, she said gently. The treatments make him very tired. Mrs. Chen stood to leave, but Tommy reached for her hand. Will you come back tomorrow? There's someone I want you to meet. Of course, Mrs. Chen promised, squeezing his hand. I'll be here. Outside in the hospital corridor, Lisa walked Mrs. Chen to the elevator. Thank you for coming, she said. I haven't seen him this animated in weeks. Thank you for letting me visit, Mrs. Chen replied. Tommy is a special boy. I've known that since he first knocked on my door. Lisa nodded, hesitating before speaking again. There's something you should know about Tommy wanting you to meet someone tomorrow. He's made friends with another patient here, a younger boy named Alex who's just starting treatment. Tommy's been telling him stories to help him feel less scared. Many of those stories, I realize now, were about you and your Christmas visits. Mrs. Chen felt a warmth spread through her chest. He's been sharing our tradition? Yes, Lisa said. And I think he's trying to connect the people he cares about while he still can. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Chen wanted to ask more, to understand exactly what Lisa was implying about Tommy's prognosis, but she couldn't form the words. I'll see you tomorrow, she said instead, stepping into the elevator with a heart both full and breaking. Back in her hotel room, Mrs. Chen sat by the window watching the unfamiliar city lights. Something significant had shifted today. What had begun as a simple Christmas tradition between a lonely old woman and a kind-hearted boy had grown into something neither of them could have anticipated. And tomorrow, it seemed, their story would take yet another unexpected turn. Mrs. Chen slept poorly that night, her dreams filled with images of Tommy, both the healthy, vibrant boy who had knocked on her door all those years and the pale, thin teenager in the hospital bed. By morning, she felt drained but determined to be strong for today's visit. She stopped at a craft store before heading to the hospital, purchasing colorful paper, markers, glue, and various decorative items. The cashier smiled as she rang up the supplies. Making something with your grandkids? She asked. Mrs. Chen paused, then nodded. Something like that. When she arrived at the hospital, Lisa was in the hallway speaking with a doctor. Their expressions were serious, and Mrs. Chen held back, not wanting to interrupt. After the doctor walked away, Lisa noticed her and attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good morning, Mrs. Chen. Tommy's been asking when you'd arrive. Is everything all right? Mrs. Chen asked, gesturing toward where the doctor had been. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. They're adjusting his treatment plan. The latest round isn't working as well as they hoped. She seemed about to say more, then shook her head. But he's having a good day energy-wise. That's what matters right now. Inside the room, Tommy was sitting up in bed, looking through the photo album Mrs. Chen had given him the previous day. When he saw her, his face brightened. You came back. I promised I would, Mrs. Chen replied, setting down her bag of craft supplies. And I brought some things I thought we might use today. Tommy's eyes lit up at the sight of the colorful papers and markers. Are we making Christmas ornaments? It's only May. Mrs. Chen smiled. It's never too early for creativity. Besides, I missed our December tradition. I thought perhaps we could make up for it now. For the next hour, they worked side by side, cutting, folding, and decorating paper ornaments. Mrs. Chen showed Tommy how to make intricate paper snowflakes, a skill her grandmother had taught her as a child. Tommy's hands shook slightly from weakness, but his determination never wavered as he created increasingly complex designs. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. A nurse entered, wheeling in another young patient. The boy was small, perhaps 7 or 8, with a colorful knit beanie covering his head. His thin face was marked by fear and uncertainty. Alex. Tommy's face lit up. Come in. This is my friend Mrs. Chen that I told you about. The younger boy looked at Mrs. Chen shyly. Hi, he whispered. Hello, Alex, Mrs. Chen said warmly. Tommy tells me you're a very brave young man. Alex didn't respond directly, but he wheeled himself closer to see what they were making. Those are cool, he said, pointing to the paper snowflakes. Would you like to make one? Mrs. Chen offered. Soon, all three were engrossed in the craft project. As they worked, Mrs. Chen noticed how Tommy interacted with Alex, gently encouraging him, praising his efforts, making him laugh with silly jokes. It reminded her so much of how her own children had behaved with younger siblings, a natural protective instinct combined with genuine care. Tommy tells me stories about Christmas, Alex said unexpectedly, carefully cutting along the fold lines of his paper. About how he used to visit you every year with presents. Yes, that's true, Mrs. Chen replied, glancing at Tommy. He started when he was about your age. He said you make the best hot chocolate in the world, Alex continued. With tiny marshmallows and cinnamon. Mrs. Chen smiled. That's very kind of him to say. And he told me about the star ornament, Alex said. The very first one. He said it was probably the ugliest star ever made, but you hung it on your tree anyway. Tommy laughed. It was ugly. I was 8 and used way too much yellow paint. I still have it on my mantle, Mrs. Chen said. It's one of my most precious possessions. Alex looked up at her, his eyes serious. Tommy says sometimes the best friends come from unexpected places. Like you guys. The simple observation made Mrs. Chen's heart swell. Tommy is very wise, she said. They continued crafting until Alex began to tire. As the nurse came to take him back to his room, he hesitated. Can I take my snowflakes with me? Of course, Mrs. Chen said, helping him gather his creations. And perhaps I can teach you some new designs tomorrow, if you'd like. Alex nodded eagerly. Tommy said you might be teaching some art classes here. For kids who have to stay a long time. Mrs. Chen raised an eyebrow at Tommy, who shrugged with a mischievous smile. I might have mentioned something like that. After Alex left, Tommy's energy seemed to fade rapidly. He leaned back against his pillows, his breathing slightly labored. You should rest, Mrs. Chen said, beginning to clean up the craft supplies. Wait, Tommy said. I need to ask you something important. Mrs. Chen sat down beside him, her heart quickening at his serious tone. Alex has been here 3 weeks, Tommy explained. His family lives far away and can only visit on weekends. The rest of the time, he's alone. He paused, gathering strength. The doctors say I need to stay focused on my treatment. Mom says that means I need to conserve my energy, but I think it means I need to focus on what's important. And what's important to you, Tommy? Mrs. Chen asked softly, though she suspected she knew the answer. Making sure Alex isn't alone, Tommy said simply. Like you did for me. Mrs. Chen felt tears gathering in her eyes. What are you asking me? Stay, Tommy said. Not just for a few days. Stay in Reno, at least for a while. The hospital has this program for volunteers who work with kids like us. People who read stories, help with homework, or teach art. He gestured to the paper snowflakes. You'd be perfect for it. The request took Mrs. Chen's breath away. Stay in Reno? Leave behind her home of 40 years? It seemed impossible. And yet, looking at Tommy, this boy who had changed her life with a simple knock on her door, she found herself considering it. What was waiting for her back in Pine Creek Lane? An empty house. A garden. Neighbors who barely knew her. Here, she could have purpose again. I don't know, Tommy, she said honestly. It's a big decision. Just think about it, Tommy replied, his eyes beginning to close from exhaustion. Promise? I promise, Mrs. Chen said, squeezing his hand gently. Later, in the hospital cafeteria, Lisa joined Mrs. Chen for coffee. The younger woman looked exhausted, the weight of her worry evident in every movement. Tommy told me what he asked you, Lisa said after they'd sat in silence for a few minutes. About staying here. Mrs. Chen nodded. It's very like him to be thinking of others, even now. Even now, Lisa repeated, her voice catching. She stared into her coffee cup. The doctors told me this morning that the cancer has spread to his spine. They're talking about quality of life now, not remission. The words hung in the air between them, devastating in their finality. Mrs. Chen felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. How long? She whispered. Lisa shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. Months, not years. Maybe until Christmas, if we're lucky. She looked up, meeting Mrs. Chen's eyes. He doesn't know yet. I haven't found the words. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and took Lisa's hand in hers. Two women connected by their love for one extraordinary boy, facing an unimaginable loss together. You don't have to decide about staying, Lisa said after a while. Tommy has big ideas, but he doesn't always understand practicalities. Mrs. Chen thought about her empty house waiting for her back in Pine Creek Lane. She thought about the garden that would bloom without her, the quiet rooms that held memories but little joy. And she thought about a young boy named Alex, alone in a hospital except for weekends, who needed someone to teach him how to make paper snowflakes. Actually, Mrs. Chen said slowly, I think I might have already decided. The next morning, Mrs. Chen called her neighbor back home and asked for a favor that went far beyond watering plants. She needed someone to check her mail, maintain the house, and pack some additional clothing and personal items to send to her in Reno. The neighbor, surprised but understanding, agreed to help. How long will you be staying? The neighbor asked. I'm not sure, Mrs. Chen replied honestly. Perhaps for quite some time. Her next call was to her children. They were concerned at first, questioning why their typically routine-oriented mother was suddenly living in a hotel in Reno to visit a boy they'd never heard her mention before. But as Mrs. Chen explained the story of Tommy's Christmas visits over the years and his current situation, their concern turned to support. Mom, this sounds important to you, her daughter finally said. If you need anything, money, help with arrangements, just let us know. Thank you, Mrs. Chen said, touched by their understanding. I think I need to do this. With those difficult calls behind her, Mrs. Chen visited the hospital volunteer office. The coordinator, a kind woman named Donna, listened to her story with interest. We always need volunteers in pediatric oncology, Donna explained. Many people find it too emotionally challenging, but the children there need connection more than anyone. Mrs. Chen filled out the necessary paperwork and was told that after a background check and brief training, she could begin volunteering within a week. In the meantime, she was still welcome to visit Tommy as a personal guest. When she shared the news with Tommy later that day, his face lit up with more energy than she had seen since arriving in Reno. You're really staying? For real? The hope in his voice made her decision feel even more right. For real, Mrs. Chen confirmed. I've already found a small apartment to rent month to month. It's just a few blocks from the hospital. What she didn't tell him was that the apartment was nearly twice her usual monthly budget, or that her modest retirement savings would be stretched thin by this unplanned relocation. Some details didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Chen fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent in her small apartment, cooking simple meals to bring to Lisa at the hospital. Afternoons were dedicated to volunteering in the pediatric ward after her training was complete. She read stories, helped with homework, and taught crafts to children of all ages who were battling various illnesses. Alex became one of her regular visitors. Unlike some of the other children who drifted in and out of the activities room depending on their energy levels, Alex sought her out specifically. Tommy says you know all the best Chinese folktales, he said one day as they worked on origami. Mrs. Chen smiled. Tommy gives me too much credit. But I do know a few stories my grandmother taught me. Will you tell me one? Alex asked, his small fingers struggling with a complicated fold. And so Mrs. Chen began sharing the stories of her childhood, tales of clever rabbits outwitting tigers, of moon goddesses and their jade palaces, of loyal friends and magical journeys. Alex listened with rapt attention, just as Tommy once had during their Christmas visits. Tommy's condition continued to decline in small, subtle ways. Some days were better than others. On good days, he would join them in the activities room, showing remarkable patience while teaching younger children how to make simple ornaments from pipe cleaners and beads. On difficult days, Mrs. Chen would sit quietly by his bedside, reading aloud or simply keeping him company while he slept. One evening in late June, Mrs. Chen arrived at the hospital to find Lisa in the hallway outside Tommy's room, speaking with Dr. Rivera, Tommy's oncologist. The doctor's expression was grave, and Lisa was wiping tears from her eyes. Mrs. Chen waited at a respectful distance until their conversation ended. As Dr. Rivera walked away, Lisa noticed her and attempted a smile that quickly crumbled. "What is it?" Mrs. Chen asked, her heart pounding. "Has something happened?" Lisa took a deep breath. "The latest scans showed the cancer has spread further. They're stopping the treatment." Her voice broke. "There's nothing more they can do except keep him comfortable. They're talking about hospice care now." The word hit Mrs. Chen like a physical blow. Hospice. The end of the road. "How long?" she whispered. "Maybe a few months," Lisa said, her voice hollow. "If we're lucky." Mrs. Chen stood in stunned silence, absorbing the news. Despite knowing that Tommy's prognosis was poor, she had harbored a secret hope for a miracle. Now, that hope was fading. "Does he know?" she finally asked. Lisa nodded. "We just told him. Dr. Rivera and I. He took it better than I did, honestly. He asked if he could go home instead of staying in the hospital. Dr. Rivera said it might be possible with the right setup." "Home?" Mrs. Chen asked, confused. "You mean back to your apartment?" "Actually, no," Lisa said, looking uncomfortable. "He asked if we could go back to Pine Creek. He said he wants to see the snow one more time. To have one more Christmas." Mrs. Chen's breath caught. "One more Christmas. In July." "I had to tell him that's not possible," Lisa continued, her voice breaking. "I can't afford to move us back there, and his medical needs. What if you didn't have to worry about housing?" Mrs. Chen interrupted, an idea forming. "What if you could stay in my house? It's just sitting empty right now." Lisa stared at her. "Mrs. Chen, that's incredibly generous, but there's still the matter of medical care. Tommy needs." "There's a good hospital just 20 minutes from Pine Creek," Mrs. Chen said, the plan crystallizing in her mind. "I've looked into hospice services before, for my husband. They can come to the home." She took Lisa's hands in hers. "If Tommy wants to go back, if he wants to see snow again, we should try to make it happen." Tears flowed freely down Lisa's face now. "Why would you do this for us? You barely know us." Mrs. Chen thought about the little boy who had appeared on her doorstep 9 years ago with a clumsily wrapped package. She thought about 8 Christmas visits that had brightened her lonely life. She thought about Tommy's extraordinary kindness, shown not just to her but to everyone around him, even as he fought for his own life. "Tommy gave me 8 Christmases," she said simply. "I'd like to give him one more." Later that evening, Mrs. Chen sat beside Tommy's bed. He was awake but quiet, his eyes focused on the ceiling. "Your mom told me what the doctor said," Mrs. Chen began gently. "And what you asked for." Tommy turned to look at her, his eyes tired but clear. "They said no." "It's okay. I understand." "Actually," Mrs. Chen said, "I think we might be able to work something out." As she outlined her plan, Tommy's expression shifted from disbelief to cautious hope. By the time she finished explaining, he was smiling, a genuine smile that reminded her of the boy who had bounded up her porch steps so many Decembers ago. "Do you really think we could do it?" he asked. "Go back to Pine Creek?" Mrs. Chen nodded firmly. "If that's what you want, we'll make it happen. One more Christmas, Tommy. In July." For the first time since arriving in Reno, Mrs. Chen felt a sense of clarity and purpose that went beyond volunteering or even friendship. She was making a promise that would require all her resources and energy to fulfill. But looking at Tommy's hopeful face, she knew it was the right thing to do. Some promises, after all, were meant to be kept no matter the cost. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Mrs. Chen flew back to Pine Creek ahead of Tommy and Lisa to get the house ready. Her children came to help, transforming the spare bedroom into a comfortable space where Tommy could rest. They installed a hospital bed, rearranged furniture to accommodate a wheelchair, and made the bathroom accessible. Mrs. Chen's son, David, a doctor himself, helped coordinate with the local hospital and hospice services. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" he asked as they sorted through medical paperwork. "It's going to be emotionally difficult." Mrs. Chen nodded. "I've never been more certain of anything." Meanwhile, her daughter, Lynn, focused on a different kind of preparation. "If we're doing Christmas in July," she said, "we're going to do it properly." She brought boxes of decorations down from the attic, untangling strings of lights and setting up the artificial tree in the living room. "This is a bit much, isn't it?" Mrs. Chen asked, watching as Lynn hung garlands along the staircase. Lynn shook her head. "Not at all. From what you've told us about Tommy, he deserves a real Christmas miracle." News of Tommy's situation spread quickly through the Pine Creek community. Mrs. Chen's neighbors, many of whom had barely spoken to her in the past, began stopping by to offer help. Some brought meals for the freezer, others volunteered to assist with yard work or transportation once Tommy arrived. Mrs. Patel from down the street, a retired nurse, offered to give Lisa breaks from caregiving duties. "I never realized how supportive this community could be," Mrs. Chen told Lisa during their daily phone calls. "People I've lived next to for years but barely knew are coming together for Tommy." "That's the effect he has," Lisa replied. "He brings out the best in people." On July 15th, Tommy arrived in Pine Creek. The journey had been exhausting for him, but as the medical transport pulled up to Mrs. Chen's blue house, his face brightened. "It looks exactly the same," he said as the attendants helped him into the wheelchair. Mrs. Chen was waiting on the porch, just as she had been for 8 Christmas visits. But this time, when Tommy looked up at her, they both knew it would be the last. Inside, the house had been transformed. Christmas lights twinkled on every wall. The tree stood adorned with ornaments, including the 8 handmade ones from Tommy prominently displayed. Holiday music played softly in the background, and the scent of gingerbread filled the air. "Wow," Tommy breathed, taking it all in. "You really went all out." "Christmas in July requires a certain commitment to detail," Mrs. Chen said with a smile. That evening, after Tommy had rested and settled into his new room, Mrs. Chen prepared hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows and cinnamon, just as she had for every Christmas visit. They sat in the living room, the July heat outside contrasting strangely with the winter holiday scene inside. "There's just one thing missing," Tommy said, looking out the window at the sunny day. "The snow." Mrs. Chen squeezed his hand. "We'll figure something out." The next morning, Mrs. Chen woke to the sound of machinery outside. Looking out her window, she was astonished to see a truck parked in front of her house. Men were unloading what appeared to be a snow machine, the kind used at ski resorts. She hurried downstairs and outside. "What's going on here?" One of the workers handed her a note. "Delivery for the Chen residence, courtesy of Pine Creek Community Fund." The note read simply, "For Tommy's Christmas. From all of us at Pine Creek." When Tommy woke up and was helped to the window, his face filled with wonder. Outside, a blanket of artificial snow covered Mrs. Chen's front yard. Neighborhood children were already playing in it, building small snowmen and making snow angels. "Can I go out?" Tommy asked, his voice full of longing. With Lisa's careful help and wrapped in warm blankets despite the summer heat, Tommy was taken outside to experience the snow. For a brief time, the fatigue and pain that had become his constant companions seemed to fade as he watched the neighborhood children play. A small boy approached Tommy's wheelchair, holding out a handful of snow. "Is this your Christmas party?" he asked. Tommy nodded. "Kind of. It's the coolest thing ever," the boy declared. "Christmas in July. My mom says you're the reason we get to have snow today." Tommy smiled. "I just wanted to see snow one more time. I didn't know everyone else would get to enjoy it too." As the days passed, Tommy's strength continued to decline, but his spirits remained remarkably high. He received a steady stream of visitors, curious neighbors, former classmates who had heard he was back in town, and even Mr. Rivera from the hardware store. Most special was the day when a car pulled up and Alex stepped out with his parents. Mrs. Chen had arranged for them to visit, knowing how important the friendship was to both boys. "You weren't kidding about the Christmas in July thing," Alex said, taking in the decorated house with wide eyes. Tommy grinned weakly from his position on the couch. "Mrs. Chen never does anything halfway." The two boys spent the afternoon talking and playing board games, their shared experience of illness creating a bond that needed few words. Before Alex left, Tommy gave him a small box. "It's this year's Christmas ornament," he explained. "I made it in the hospital when I was feeling better one day." Inside was a carefully crafted clay star, painted yellow with uneven strokes, a deliberate echo of the very first ornament he had given Mrs. Chen 9 years earlier. "But it's your tradition with Mrs. Chen," Alex protested. Tommy shook his head. "Traditions are meant to be shared. Maybe you can visit her next Christmas." As July turned to August, Tommy's health took a sharp decline. The hospice nurse visited daily now, and Tommy spent most of his time sleeping. On a warm August evening, as the artificial snow in the yard had long since melted away, he asked to speak with Mrs. Chen alone. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Chen leaned close. "What is it, Tommy?" "That first Christmas, when I brought you the star, it wasn't random." He paused, gathering strength. "I saw you at the grocery store that week. You were picking out a frozen dinner for one, and you looked so sad. The cashier asked if you were looking forward to Christmas, and you said there wasn't much to look forward to anymore." Mrs. Chen remembered that day, though vaguely. She had been particularly low that year, missing her husband terribly as the holidays approached. "I followed you home," Tommy continued. "I don't know why. Maybe because you reminded me of my grandmother who had just died. I thought nobody should be sad at Christmas. So I made you the star." Tears filled Mrs. Chen's eyes. "You never told me this." Tommy's lips curved into a faint smile. "I was 8. I didn't think it was important to explain. I just knew you needed a friend. And then I kept coming back because I realized something." "What was that?" Mrs. Chen asked softly. "I needed a friend too," Tommy whispered. "Thank you for being mine." Tommy passed away peacefully 3 days later, with his mother on one side of his bed and Mrs. Chen on the other. His final Christmas, in the middle of summer, had been everything he wished for. The funeral was held in Pine Creek, attended by the entire community. Mrs. Chen was surprised to see how many lives Tommy had touched, even beyond her own. His classmates spoke of his kindness, his teachers of his curiosity, and the hospital staff who had traveled from Reno shared stories of his courage. When the service ended, Alex approached Mrs. Chen, the clay star clutched in his hand. "Tommy said I should visit you at Christmas," he said shyly. "Would that be okay?" Lisa, overhearing, placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "We don't want to impose, Mrs. Chen. You've done so much already." Mrs. Chen looked at the small boy holding Tommy's final gift, and she knew what Tommy had been trying to do, not just fulfill his own wish to see snow again, but to ensure that the tradition he had started would continue, that the connections he had made would remain. "I would like that very much," she said. December 20th. "I'll have hot chocolate waiting." That December, as snow fell naturally over Pine Creek Lane, Mrs. Chen stood by her window watching for visitors. Her house was no longer the quiet, lonely place it had once been. Lisa had moved into the neighborhood, taking a job at the local community center, and they had become close friends. Mrs. Chen's own children visited more frequently now, bringing grandchildren who loved hearing stories about the special boy who had started a Christmas tradition. At precisely 4 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Chen opened it to find Alex standing on her porch, his cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a crudely wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," Mrs. Chen replied, opening the door wider. "Please come in." As she welcomed this new friend into her home, Mrs. Chen felt Tommy's presence in the gentle falling snow, in the star ornaments hanging on her tree, and in the continuation of a tradition that had begun with one small act of kindness, a knock on a stranger's door at Christmas time.